The body of 25-year-old Rodney Nastis was found lying in an industrial area just north of a power plant on the outskirts of Saskatoon. 5 days later, Lawrence Kim Wagner, a 30-year-old student at Federated College, was discovered in a field near the Queen Elizabeth II power plant. Both men had died in the bitter cold of a Saskatchewan winter.
Oof.
The Saskatoon Police Service called in the RCMP for an external investigation, but for many, the details felt eerily similar. On November 29, 1990, when the temperatures in Saskatoon plunged to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, construction workers came across the frozen body of 17-year-old Neil Stonechild, a member of the Saulteaux First Nation. Neil was found in a field on the outskirts of town, wearing jeans, a light jacket, and only one shoe. The autopsy ruled his cause of death as hypothermia. Police closed the case within 3 days. But Neil's last known moments tell a different story. Witnesses saw him in the backseat of a police car the night he disappeared. His friend remembered hearing his voice, raw with fear. "Help me. They're going to kill me." A police officer would later dismiss his death with a single sentence. "The kid went out, got drunk, went for a walk, and froze to death." But that explanation would not hold because over the next decades, more Indigenous men would be found in the same way. Alone.
So all of these bodies are Indigenous peoples?
Alone in the snow, on the edges of town in the dead of winter. And soon Saskatoon would have a name for it: the Starlight Tours. Inquests into the deaths of Nastis and Stonechild determined that they both died of hypothermia, but no evidence of police involvement was noted. John White, Saskatchewan's Deputy Justice Minister, shared that the RCMP got involved after the police chief requested an outside investigation into the troubling series of incidents. On January 28, 2000, police picked up Daryl Knight, a Cree man in Saskatoon. He thought he was being taken to a drunk tank, but instead he was given a Starlight tour and dropped off 3 miles outside city limits.
Okay, so what's happening allegedly is people are picking up these individuals and driving them to a remote location where it's 80,000 degrees below zero and leaving them there to die. They're not killing them and dumping bodies.
To clarify, it's police.
That has been determined. Okay.
So Daryl Knight was dropped off 3 miles outside city limits. According to the Washington Post, one of the officers even yelled at him, "Get out of the fucking car, you fucking Indian." He was dressed in a jean jacket over a t-shirt, and it was biting cold that night. He could have easily become another victim of the so-called Saskatoon freezing deaths, but he managed, after an exhausting 2-mile trek in the freezing darkness, to make it to the power station, where a watchman helped him get out before frostbite could take hold. So the two officers who were involved in this incident, Constables Dan Hatchen and Ken Munson from the Saskatoon Police Service, insisted that they were just giving Knight a ride home at his request. Meanwhile, Police Chief Dave Scott claimed that there was no reason to connect Knight's incident to the deaths that followed of Nastis and Wagner.
How did they come to that determination? It sounds like all of those cases are fairly identical.
Yeah, it seems like it would be odd that it was a coincidence. As the investigation continued, Knight started to receive death threats because he was saying, the police did this, and police are saying, nuh-uh. But the practice of Starlight Tours has been reported as far back as the 1970s, and it likely started even earlier. Indigenous peoples around Saskatoon had long talked about being picked up by police and left outside the city in freezing conditions. But sadly, these stories were often brushed aside or ignored. One of the first cases recognized as a potential Starlight Tour happened in 1976, when an Indigenous man was found frozen to death outside Saskatoon under suspicious circumstances. But many of these early cases remain unconfirmed because they weren't thoroughly investigated or investigated at all. The death of Neil Stonechild in 1990 is often seen as the first well-documented case, and that's mainly due to the investigations of other cases that followed and being able to trace it back and say, see what happened here? It's very similar to what happened here and what happened here and what happened here. But it's important to remember that Indigenous residents have been aware of these disturbing practices for decades before they gained national attention.
And they were fearful for their lives, so they did not report it.
Yeah. I mean, the man who survived, Knight, reporting it made him in danger. And so if you're seeing that happen, how do you make a choice? Do you just move on? It's really a tough situation. And when you can see a pattern of Indigenous issues being ignored or flat out denied, what's the point of putting yourself in danger?
Yeah. You really have to weigh what the retaliation might be against the crime that's already been committed. It must be just horrible, especially for family members and friends, to know this is going on and fearing for their lives to say something.
And knowing why you and your people are being targeted.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. And eventually, the two officers that had abandoned Knight on the outskirts of city in freezing temperatures did face consequences. Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson were convicted of unlawful confinement, and both officers were fired from the police force and sentenced to 8 months in jail. In 2003, Saskatoon Police Chief Russell Sabo admitted that officers had likely been involved in a practice of abandoning Indigenous people outside city limits, known as Starlight Tours, for years. So in recent developments, there were memorial initiatives in place. In May of last year, Saskatoon resident Sarah Smokey Day initiated a fundraising campaign to establish a memorial for Neil Stonechild, the 17-year-old whose death in 1990 became emblematic of the Starlight Tours. The importance of educating future generations about these events is essential. In April of 2023, Daryl Knight, whose survival in 2000 became a focal point because he survived and was able to point the finger and say, no, this is what happened.
Yeah.
He passed away. But his courageous decision to speak out led to increased scrutiny of police conduct and highlighted the systemic issues within law enforcement.
So when he passed away, was it from natural? It wasn't nefarious. It was more of a natural passing,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So while progress has been made and finally officials are saying, yes, this is something that is happening and has happened, we hear you. We're not just ignoring the issue anymore. The journey toward reconciliation and justice continues, and it is going to be a long road. And one of the most important parts of that is education and making sure that we are aware that this kind of thing still happens and not just pretend like, oh no, everything's fine. Racism isn't a thing.
Racism is everywhere. There's no question about that.
I think a big part of the problem is that racism against Indigenous peoples is often brushed aside or ignored completely.
Yeah, still
And
to this
that's
day.
why those who do speak up about this kind of incident are so brave, and why it's so important to talk about them, even though maybe it's a dark, heavy story for something like the Box of Oddities, but it's so important to talk about. And I just really appreciate those that do.
As far as the subject matter fitting into the Box of Oddities, we do cover a lot of true crime type stories, and that clearly fits in. But it's an important message, and one that I think is especially important today.
I got my information from The Guardian, from several articles on cbc.ca, Wikipedia, obviously, and the always fabulous Shaylazon Leroux, where I first heard about this on her TikTok.
Shaylazon Leroux. I love that.
Auntie.
It's fun to say.
Yeah.
Well, that was heavy. You weren't kidding.
No.
That was some serious crap.
Sorry about that. I've been rolling this one around for a bit, but I couldn't. It kept coming up in my mind, and I had to get it out.